The autumn of 1894 brought with it a peculiar chill to London, dampness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the city and settle there with stubborn persistence. The fog rolled through the streets like a living creature, swallowing lampposts and hansom cabs alike, reducing the great metropolis to a series of ghostly silhouettes and muffled sounds. It was on such an evening that Dr. John Watson found himself ascending the 17 steps to the familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street, his medical bag weighing heavily in his hand after a long day attending to patients in Paddington. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth as he entered, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered room, a welcome contrast to the gray misery outside. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual armchair, his long legs stretched toward the flames, a pipe clenched between his teeth, and his sharp eyes fixed upon the evening edition of the Times. He did not look up as Watson entered, though a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth suggested he was well aware of his friend's presence. "Your patient in Paddington," Holmes said without preamble. "The elderly widow with the respiratory complaint. I trust she is recovering?" Watson paused in the act of removing his coat, a smile forming despite his weariness. "I have long since given up asking how you deduce these things, Holmes. But yes, Mrs. Pemberton is on the mend." "Elementary," Holmes replied, finally lowering the newspaper to regard his companion. "The particular shade of coal dust on your left cuff is distinctive to the Paddington district, where the railway deposits leave a characteristic residue. Your bag shows the weight distribution of someone carrying a stethoscope and respiratory medicines, heavier on the right side where you keep such implements. And the faint scent of eucalyptus oil clings to your sleeve, a common remedy for ailments of the chest. As for the widow, there is a single gray hair on your shoulder, far too long and fine to belong to a gentleman. And your manner suggests the satisfaction of a physician whose patient is improving rather than declining." Watson shook his head, settling into the chair opposite his friend. "Remarkable as always. Though I wonder sometimes if you might apply such talents to something more significant than deducing the mundane details of my afternoon rounds." At this, Holmes' expression shifted. The languid indifference that so often characterized his features gave way to something sharper, a gleam of interest that Watson had come to recognize over many years of partnership. "Significant, you say?" Holmes reached for the newspaper he had set aside and extended it toward Watson. "Then perhaps you might cast your eye upon the obituary section of this evening's edition. Third column, halfway down. Tell me what you observe." Watson accepted the paper with a puzzled frown. His eyes scanned the columns of densely printed text announcements of deaths, memorial notices, the usual parade of mortality that filled such pages in any newspaper. Then his gaze fell upon the notice Holmes had indicated, and he read aloud, "Blackwood, Sir Edmund, of Ravenswood Manor, Hampshire. Died peacefully at his London residence, 14 Belgrave Square, on the evening of October 3, 1894, aged 78 years. Beloved father and devoted servant of the Crown. Funeral service is to be held privately. No flowers by request." Watson looked up, confusion evident upon his features. "A distinguished gentleman has passed away. Sad, certainly, but I fail to see what is remarkable about. Read further." Holmes interrupted, gesturing with the stem of his pipe. "Same column, 7 notices below." Watson's eyes traveled down the page, and as he read the second obituary, his confusion transformed into something approaching astonishment. "Blackwood, Sir Edmund, of Ravenswood Manor, Hampshire. Died suddenly at the Grand Imperial Hotel, London, on the evening of October 5, 1894, aged 78 years. Beloved father and faithful servant of the Empire. Private interment to follow." "Good heavens," Watson breathed. "The same man dead twice? 2 days apart?" "Precisely." Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace before the fire. his thin frame animated by the particular energy that always seized him when confronted with a puzzle. Sir Edmund Blackwood, by all accounts a pillar of the establishment, former diplomat, advisor to 3 successive prime ministers, a man whose influence stretched from the Foreign Office to the highest circles of aristocratic society. And yet, according to the official record, he has managed the remarkable feat of dying not once, but twice, in the span of 48 hours. Surely it must be an error, Watson suggested. A printing mistake, perhaps, or some confusion at the newspaper office. Holmes shook his head slowly, his gray eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond the walls of their sitting room. I considered that possibility, naturally. But observe the differences in the notices, Watson. The first describes him as a devoted servant of the Crown, while the second calls him a faithful servant of the Empire. The locations differ: Belgrave Square versus the Grand Imperial Hotel. The first mentions funeral services. The second speaks of interment. These are not the errors of a careless typesetter. They are 2 distinct notices, submitted by 2 distinct parties, each claiming to announce the death of the same man. Watson set down the newspaper, his medical instincts now fully engaged. Then what are we to make of it? Could there be 2 Sir Edmund Blackwoods? There could be, Holmes conceded, though my inquiries this afternoon suggest otherwise. There is but one Sir Edmund Blackwood of Ravenswood Manor, and he has been a prominent figure in London society for more than 50 years. No, Watson, I believe we are confronted with one of 2 possibilities. Either a man has died twice, or someone has gone to considerable trouble to make it appear so. Before Watson could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door below, followed by the measured tread of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs. A moment later, their long-suffering landlady appeared in the doorway, a silver tray in her hands bearing a single calling card. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He says it is a matter of the utmost urgency." Holmes plucked the card from the tray and examined it with keen interest. His eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly as he read the name engraved upon it, and he exchanged a meaningful glance with Watson before turning back to Mrs. Hudson. "Show him up at once, if you please. And Mrs. Hudson, we may require tea. I suspect this will be a long evening." As their landlady departed, Watson leaned forward in his chair. "Who is it, Holmes?" Holmes handed him the card, a thin smile playing upon his lips. "A man uniquely positioned to shed light upon our current puzzle, Watson. Or, alternatively, to deepen it considerably." Watson looked down at the card in his hand. The name printed upon it, in elegant script: "Reed Colon, Mr. Arthur Blackwood, Ravenswood Manor." "Hampshire, the dead man's son," Watson murmured. "Indeed," Holmes replied, resuming his seat and steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "And unless I am very much mistaken, he is about to tell us that his father has died, though which death he comes to report remains to be seen." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets below, a carriage clattered past on cobblestones. Watson found himself gripping the arms of his chair with unconscious tension, his thoughts racing through the impossible permutations of the puzzle before them. A man who died twice, an obituary that contradicted itself, and now a grieving son ascending the stairs to Baker Street, bearing news that might prove more terrible and more complex than either of them could yet imagine. The door opened, and Mr. Arthur Blackwood entered the room. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, tall and well-made, with the kind of distinguished bearing that spoke of old money and excellent breeding. His face, however, told a different story, one of sleepless nights and profound distress. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat and gloves. His suit, though clearly expensive, appeared rumpled, as if he had dressed in haste or slept in his clothes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice hoarse, "thank God you are available. I had feared, after reading of your exploits in the papers, that you might be engaged upon some other matter." Holmes gestured toward the chair that Watson had vacated, rising to offer their guest a seat. "I am at your disposal, Mr. Blackwood. Please sit. You have traveled from Hampshire, I observe. Though you spent last night at a hotel in London, not Belgrave Square, I think, but somewhere in the vicinity of Marylebone." Arthur Blackwood sank into the offered chair, his expression flickering between gratitude and astonishment. "You know of my father's house in Belgrave Square?" "I know of your father's death," Holmes replied, returning to his own seat. "Or rather, I know of your father's deaths, plural. It is a most unusual case, Mr. Blackwood, and I confess it has piqued my curiosity considerably." The effect of these words upon their visitor was remarkable. Arthur Blackwood's face, already pale, turned ashen. He gripped the arms of his chair and leaned forward, his eyes fixed upon Holmes with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Then you have seen the notices," he said. "You understand why I am here." "I have seen the notices," Holmes confirmed. "But I do not yet understand anything." "That, Mr. Blackwood, is where you come in. Tell us everything from the beginning, if you please. Omit no detail, however insignificant it may seem. In my experience, it is often the smallest particulars that illuminate the greatest mysteries." Arthur Blackwood nodded slowly, gathering himself. He accepted the glass of brandy that Watson pressed into his hand, taking a long draught before he began to speak. "My father," he said at last, "was a complicated man. Mr. Holmes. He served the Crown for more than 40 years. In what capacity, I was never entirely certain, though I suspect his duties extended well beyond the official diplomatic functions that appeared in the public record. He made enemies, powerful enemies, over the course of his career, though he rarely spoke of them. He also made a fortune through investments and careful management of the family estates." Holmes listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes never leaving their visitor's face. 3 days ago, on the evening of October 3rd, I received a telegram at Ravenswood Manor. It was from my father's personal physician, Dr. Howard Mercer, informing me that my father had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the London house in Belgrave Square. I was grief-stricken, naturally, but not entirely surprised. My father was 78 years old, and his health had been declining for some months. "You traveled to London immediately?" Holmes inquired. "I took the first available train the following morning, but when I arrived at Belgrave Square, I found the house locked and shuttered. The servants had been dismissed, all of them, without notice. There was no sign of my father's body, no evidence of any funeral preparations, nothing. I searched for Dr. Mercer, but his offices were closed, and his landlady informed me that he had left London suddenly, without leaving a forwarding address." Watson leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Most irregular. Did you contact the police?" "I did," Arthur Blackwood replied. "And this is where the matter becomes truly inexplicable. Mr. Holmes, the police informed me that they had no record of any death at 14 Belgrave Square. According to their files, no one had died there, not my father, not anyone. They suggested that the telegram might have been a cruel hoax." "But you did not believe that," Holmes observed. "How could I? The telegram bore Dr. Mercer's name, and I recognized the peculiar cipher my father always used in his private correspondence, a small mark in the corner of the paper, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. That cipher was present on the telegram. Either my father himself had sent it, or someone with intimate knowledge of his habits had done so." Holmes' eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "A cipher. You did not mention this detail to the police, I take it?" Arthur Blackwood shook his head. "My father taught me long ago that some secrets are best kept close. I trusted no one, least of all Scotland Yard." "A wise precaution, perhaps," Holmes murmured. "Pray continue. How did you come to discover the second obituary?" "I spent 2 days searching for answers," Arthur Blackwood said. I visited my father's club, his solicitors, his old colleagues at the Foreign Office. No one had seen him in weeks. No one knew anything about his death, or his life, for that matter. It was as if he had simply vanished from the world. He paused, taking another drink of brandy to steady himself. Then, this evening, I happened to glance at the obituary column in the Times, and there it was. A second notice of my father's death, dated 2 days after the first, claiming he had died at the Grand Imperial Hotel. I went there immediately. "Mr. Holmes," I demanded to see the register, to speak with the staff, to examine the room where he allegedly passed away. "And what did you find?" Arthur Blackwood's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I found my father's name in the register checked in on October 4th, the day after his supposed first death. I found a room that had been cleaned and sealed by order of the hotel management. And I found a chambermaid who swore, upon her mother's grave, that she had seen an old gentleman matching my father's description entering that room on the evening of October 5th, and that same gentleman being carried out, covered by a sheet, in the early hours of October 6th. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below. "A man who died on October 3rd, he said quietly, checked into a hotel on October 4th, and died again on October 5th. The impossible has occurred. Mr. Blackwood, or something designed to appear impossible." He turned back to face the room, his expression unreadable. "I will take your case. But I must warn you, the truth we uncover may prove more disturbing than the mystery itself. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Arthur Blackwood met his gaze without flinching. "My father is dead, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps he died once, perhaps he died twice. But someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to obscure the truth, and I will not rest until I know why. Whatever that truth may be, I am prepared to face it." Holmes nodded slowly, something like approval flickering in his gray eyes. "Then we begin tomorrow morning," he said. "Watson, clear your schedule. We have an investigation to conduct." And as the fog pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street, the great detective turned his formidable mind to the puzzle before him, a puzzle that would lead them through the highest corridors of power and the darkest corners of human deception, before the truth of the old man who died twice could finally be revealed. Arthur Blackwood departed shortly after midnight, leaving behind the calling card and a London address where he could be reached, a modest hotel in Marylebone, far removed from the grand establishments his family name might otherwise command. Holmes had observed this choice with interest but made no comment. Instead, standing at the window and watching their client's figure disappear into the swirling fog below, Watson remained seated by the dying fire, his mind churning through the extraordinary details they had just heard. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked steadily, marking the passage of seconds that seemed to stretch into hours. At last, unable to contain himself any longer, he broke the silence. "Holmes, what do you make of it? Surely such a thing is impossible. A man cannot die twice." Holmes turned from the window, his thin face illuminated by the flickering gaslight. "You are quite correct, Watson. A man cannot die twice. Therefore, we must conclude that one of two things has occurred. Either Sir Edmund Blackwood did not die on October 3rd, making the first obituary a deliberate falsehood, or he did not die on October 5th, making the second obituary equally false. The question is not whether an impossibility has occurred, but rather which apparent truth conceals the lie." He crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a measure of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully before continuing. "There is, of course, a third possibility, that both obituaries are false, and Sir Edmund Blackwood remains alive even now, hiding somewhere in this great city while the world believes him dead. But why?" Watson demanded. "Why would a man of his standing, a former diplomat, a pillar of society, stage his own death? And why do it twice? That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must discover. Holmes settled into his armchair, his eyes gleaming with the particular intensity that always accompanied the early stages of a challenging case. Consider what we know. Sir Edmund Blackwood was not merely a diplomat. His son's careful phrasing suggested involvement in matters far more clandestine. Duties extending beyond official diplomatic functions, Arthur said. A man who made powerful enemies over 40 years of service. This is not the profile of a simple bureaucrat, Watson. This is the profile of a spy. Watson leaned forward, his interest sharpening. You believe Sir Edmund was involved in intelligence work? I believe it is a distinct possibility. And if that is the case, then the elaborate nature of this deception begins to make a certain kind of sense. A man with secrets, dangerous secrets, might have reason to disappear. A man with enemies might choose to let those enemies believe him dead. But why die twice? Why not simply stage one convincing death and vanish? Holmes smiled thinly. An excellent question, and one to which I do not yet have an answer. But I intend to find one. He rose abruptly, moving to his desk and retrieving a worn leather notebook. Tomorrow morning, we shall begin our investigation in earnest. There are several threads to pursue the vanished physician, Dr. Howard Mercer, chief among them. A personal doctor who flees London immediately after his patient's death is either guilty of malpractice or complicit in something far more sinister. And the Grand Imperial Hotel? That too shall require our attention. But first, I wish to examine the house in Belgrave Square. A residence that has been locked and shuttered, with servants dismissed without notice. Such a place will have much to tell us, Watson. Walls remember secrets that people forget. He fell silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the fog-shrouded window. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might almost have been admiration. There is a mind at work here, Watson. A careful, methodical mind that has constructed an elaborate puzzle and laid it before us like a challenge. The double obituary was no accident. It was designed to be noticed, to draw attention, to invite investigation. Someone wants this mystery to be solved, or at least examined. The question is why? Watson shook his head slowly. I confess I cannot see the shape of it, Holmes. The pieces refuse to fit together in any pattern I can discern. Nor can I yet, Holmes admitted. But that is the nature of such puzzles, Watson. The pattern exists. We simply lack sufficient data to perceive it. Tomorrow we shall gather that data. Tonight, I suggest you retire and rest. I have a feeling the coming days will demand our fullest faculties. Watson rose, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. Holmes would spend the night in contemplation, turning the problem over in that remarkable brain, examining it from angles that would never occur to ordinary men. By morning, he would have formulated a plan of attack. As Watson paused at the door, he glanced back at his friend. Holmes had already retreated into himself, his eyes distant, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of deep concentration. "Good night, Holmes." There was no reply. The detective was already lost in the labyrinth of his own thoughts, pursuing shadows through corridors that only he could see. The morning broke gray and cold, the fog of the previous night having retreated only slightly to reveal a London shrouded in muted tones of brown and slate. Watson descended the stairs shortly after 8 o'clock to find Holmes already dressed and pacing before the window, his energy suggesting he had slept little if at all. "Ah, Watson, excellent timing," Holmes declared, snatching his coat from the stand. "I have already sent word to Arthur Blackwood, requesting the keys to his father's Belgrave Square residence. His reply arrived 10 minutes ago. He will meet us there within the hour." They breakfasted quickly on toast and strong coffee, Mrs. Hudson hovering with maternal concern over Holmes' barely touched plate. Then they were out into the chill morning air, hailing a hansom cab that carried them through streets still slick with overnight moisture. The journey from Baker Street to Belgrave Square, took them through the heart of fashionable London, past grand townhouses and elegant squares, where the wealthy conducted their carefully ordered lives. Number 14, Belgrave Square, stood at the corner of the terrace. A handsome Georgian building of pale stone that rose 4 stories above the pavement. Its windows were shuttered, as Arthur had described, and the brass knocker upon the door had been wrapped in black crepe traditional, sign of mourning that seemed strangely at odds with the house's abandoned appearance. Arthur Blackwood awaited them on the steps, his face drawn but his manner more composed than it had been the previous evening. He produced a heavy iron key and fitted it to the lock, but the door swung open before he could turn it. "It was not locked," he said, confusion evident in his voice. "I am certain I secured it myself when I departed 2 days ago." Holmes' eyes narrowed, and he held up a hand to forestall any further movement. "Wait here, both of you. Let me examine the entrance first." He dropped to one knee upon the threshold, producing his magnifying glass and studying the lock mechanism with intense concentration. His fingers traced the edge of the doorframe, pausing at several points where the wood showed faint scratches invisible to the untrained eye. "Someone has entered since your last visit, Mr. Blackwood," Holmes announced, rising to his feet. "The lock has been picked quite expertly, I might add. The scratches are fresh, made within the last 24 hours, based on the oxidation of the exposed wood." They proceeded into the entrance hall, and Watson immediately understood why Arthur Blackwood had described the place as abandoned. Dust covers draped the furniture, and the air held the stale quality of rooms long unoccupied. Yet something felt wrong, a subtle disturbance in the stillness that Watson could sense but not articulate. Holmes moved through the space with the focused intensity of a hound on the scent. He examined the floor, the walls, the placement of objects upon tables and shelves. At one point he dropped again to his knees, pressing his face nearly to the carpet and inhaling deeply. "Curious," he murmured. "Most curious indeed. What is it, Holmes?" Watson asked. "Someone has been here recently, someone who took considerable pains to conceal their presence. The dust upon these covers has been carefully redistributed to disguise recent disturbance, but the pattern is imperfect. Here, you see, and here, the dust lies too evenly, too uniformly. Nature does not arrange particles with such precision." He straightened and moved toward the staircase, his eyes traveling upward to the shadowed landing above. "Which room served as your father's bedchamber, Mr. Blackwood?" "The master suite, on the 2nd floor. 3rd door on the right." They ascended in silence, the stairs creaking beneath their feet with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the empty house. The 2nd-floor corridor stretched before them, lined with closed doors that concealed their secrets behind panels of dark oak. Holmes paused before the 3rd door, his hand resting upon the handle. "This door has been opened recently as well. The hinges have been oiled recently enough that I can still detect the scent of the lubricant. Someone wished to enter this room without making a sound." He pushed the door open, and they stepped into Sir Edmund Blackwood's bedchamber. The room was large and well appointed, furnished in the heavy Victorian style that spoke of wealth and tradition. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, its covers neatly arranged, its pillows undisturbed. The curtains were drawn against the gray morning light, and a faint odor hung in the air, something chemical, something that made Watson's nostrils twitch with professional recognition. "Chloroform," he said quietly. "Someone has used chloroform in this room, and not long ago." Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze fixed upon something on the bedside table, a small glass vial, empty now, but bearing a label that he examined with evident interest. "Indeed, Watson. And that is not the only secret this room has to offer." Holmes lifted the glass vial carefully between his thumb and forefinger, tilting it toward the pale light that filtered through the gap in the curtains. The label, written in a precise hand, bore the words "Tincture of Morphia," along with a dosage instruction and a chemist's stamp from an establishment in Harley Street. "Your father was prescribed morphine, Mr. Blackwood?" Holmes inquired, his eyes still fixed upon the vial. Arthur moved closer, his brow furrowing as he examined the small bottle. "Not to my knowledge. My father despised medicines of any kind. He considered them a weakness. Even in his final years, when the pain in his joints became considerable, he refused anything stronger than willow bark tea. And yet here we have an empty vial of morphine upon his bedside table. Prescribed by," Holmes squinted at the faded ink, "a Dr. H. Mercer, the same physician who sent the telegram announcing your father's first death, and who subsequently vanished without a trace." Watson stepped forward, his medical instincts engaged. "May I examine it, Holmes?" Holmes passed him the vial, and Watson studied it with professional attention. "This is a substantial dosage, far more than one would typically prescribe for pain management. In a man of advanced years, such a quantity could prove extremely dangerous. Potentially fatal, in fact." "Precisely what I was thinking," Holmes replied. He had moved away from the bedside and was now conducting a systematic examination of the room, opening drawers and wardrobes, running his fingers along the edges of picture frames, lifting the corners of rugs to inspect the floor beneath. Arthur Blackwood stood in the center of the room, his face pale with growing comprehension. "You believe my father was poisoned? That Dr. Mercer murdered him with an overdose of morphine?" "I believe nothing as yet, Mr. Blackwood. I merely observe and collect data. Conclusions will come later, when sufficient evidence has been gathered." Holmes paused before a writing desk positioned near the window, his attention caught by something upon its surface. "Tell me, was your father in the habit of burning his correspondence?" "Never. He kept meticulous records of everything. His papers were organized with almost obsessive precision." "Then someone else has been burning documents in this room." Holmes indicated the small brass wastepaper basket beside the desk. Within it lay a mound of gray ash, the remnants of papers that had been thoroughly consumed by flame. He knelt beside it and carefully sifted through the debris with a letter opener he had taken from the desk. "Most of it is beyond recovery," he murmured. "But here, what have we?" He extracted a small fragment of paper that had somehow escaped complete destruction. Only a corner remained, bearing a few words in what appeared to be a foreign script. Watson peered over his shoulder. "Is that Russian?" "Indeed it is. The fragment reads, if my command of the language serves me correctly, the arrangement must proceed as planned. Not terribly illuminating in itself, but it suggests that Sir Edmund's correspondence included communications from or regarding Russian interests." Arthur Blackwood's expression darkened. "My father spent many years in diplomatic service to the Crown, Mr. Holmes. Some of that service took place in Eastern Europe, though he never spoke of the details. If he was involved in matters concerning Russia, it would explain much about his secretive nature." Holmes pocketed the fragment and rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping the room one final time. "There is little more to be learned here. The room has been searched carefully, but not carefully enough to escape detection. Someone was looking for something, and based on the burned correspondence, I suspect they found it and destroyed whatever evidence might have revealed its nature. They made their way back through the silent house." Holmes pausing occasionally to examine some detail that caught his attention. A footprint in the dust near the servants' entrance. A window latch that had been forced and then carelessly relatched. A single dark hair caught upon a door hinge that he collected with evident satisfaction. Outside, the fog had lifted somewhat, revealing the elegant facades of Belgrave Square in their full grandeur. Carriages passed along the street, their occupants oblivious to the mystery that lurked behind the shuttered windows of number 14. "What now, Holmes?" Watson asked as they descended the front steps. "Now we pursue the other thread of this tangled skein, the Grand Imperial Hotel, where Sir Edmund Blackwood allegedly died for the second time." Holmes raised his hand to hail a passing cab. "If 2 deaths occurred, Watson, then 2 crime scenes exist. And somewhere between them lies the truth we seek." Arthur Blackwood hesitated at the bottom of the steps. "Should I accompany you?" Holmes considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. Return to your hotel and wait for word from me. There may be those watching for your movements, and I would prefer to conduct this next phase of investigation without alerting interested parties to our progress." The younger man nodded reluctantly and departed in the opposite direction. His shoulders bowed with the weight of uncertainty. Watson watched him go with sympathy, understanding all too well the torment of unanswered questions. "Come, Watson," Holmes said, climbing into the cab that had drawn up beside them. "The Grand Imperial awaits, and with it, perhaps, the next piece of our puzzle." The Grand Imperial Hotel stood upon the Strand like a monument to Victorian excess, its ornate facade rising 6 stories above the busy thoroughfare. Gilded letters proclaimed its name above the entrance, and liveried doormen attended to the steady stream of wealthy guests who passed through its revolving doors. It was precisely the sort of establishment where a man of Sir Edmund Blackwood's standing might choose to spend his final hours, if indeed those hours had been spent. There at all, Holmes paid the cab driver and stood for a moment upon the pavement, his sharp eyes surveying the building with calculating interest. "Observe the windows on the 4th floor, Watson. 3rd from the left." Watson followed his gaze upward. "The curtains are drawn. All the other rooms have theirs open to admit the daylight." "Precisely. That, I suspect, is the room where Sir Edmund allegedly met his second end. The management has kept it sealed, either out of respect for the deceased or more likely out of concern for what further investigation might reveal." Holmes strode toward the entrance with the confident bearing of a man who expected doors to open before him. "Come, let us see what secrets the Grand Imperial has chosen to conceal." The lobby was a cathedral of polished marble and crystal chandeliers, its atmosphere hushed and reverent despite the constant movement of guests and staff. Holmes approached the front desk with Watson close behind, and the clerk, a thin, nervous man with a precisely trimmed mustache, looked up with professional attentiveness that quickly turned to wariness. "Good morning, gentlemen. How may I assist you?" Holmes produced a card from his pocket and laid it upon the counter. "I am Sherlock Holmes. I am investigating the death of Sir Edmund Blackwood, which I understand occurred in this establishment on the evening of October 5th. I should like to examine the room where he died, and to speak with any members of staff who attended him during his stay." The clerk's face underwent a remarkable transformation, the color draining from his cheeks, his eyes darting nervously toward a door behind the desk that presumably led to the management offices. "I am afraid that is quite impossible, sir. The matter has been handled by the appropriate authorities, and the hotel has been instructed to make no further comment." "Instructed by whom?" Holmes inquired, his voice mild but his gaze sharp. "I am not at liberty to say." The clerk's hands trembled slightly as he straightened the papers before him. "If you wish to pursue the matter, I suggest you contact Scotland Yard. They have taken charge of the investigation." Holmes leaned forward, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur. "I wonder, my good man, whether you are aware that providing false information to a consulting detective engaged by the family of the deceased constitutes obstruction of justice. I wonder further whether you are aware that the inconsistencies in this case have attracted the attention of parties considerably more influential than Scotland Yard." The clerk swallowed visibly, his resolve crumbling. "I cannot help you, sir. Truly I cannot. The manager himself ordered that no one at all be permitted access to that room or information about the gentleman who occupied it. My position depends upon my obedience." "Then perhaps I might speak with your manager directly." "He is not available. He left London yesterday morning, quite suddenly. A family emergency, I was told." The clerk's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But between ourselves, sir, there was nothing sudden about it. He received a visitor the evening before, a foreign gentleman with a heavy accent, and within hours. He was packing his bags and making arrangements to close the investigation entirely. Holmes straightened, exchanging a meaningful glance with Watson. A foreign gentleman. Can you describe him? Tall, perhaps 50 years of age, with a military bearing. His hair was gray, cropped short in the continental style. He wore a dark overcoat and carried a silver-handled walking stick. The clerk hesitated, then added, "He spoke to the manager in private, but I overheard a single word as they passed my desk. A name, I think, though it meant nothing to me." "What name?" The clerk glanced around nervously, ensuring they were not overheard. "Volkov. The gentleman said something about a Volkov." And the manager turned quite pale. Holmes absorbed this information without visible reaction, though Watson noticed the slight tightening of his jaw that indicated intense interest. "One final question, if I may. The chambermaid who discovered Sir Edmund's body, is she still in the hotel's employ?" "Mary Corbett, yes. She works the morning shift on the upper floors." The clerk gestured toward a service corridor to their left. "You might find her attending to rooms on the 3rd floor at this hour. But please, sir, do not mention that I directed you. I have a family to support, and I cannot afford to lose this position." Holmes nodded curtly and turned away, his long strides carrying him toward the service corridor, with Watson hurrying to keep pace. Behind them, the clerk watched their departure with an expression of profound relief, mingled with lingering fear, the look of a man who had said more than he should and now regretted his momentary weakness. "Volkov," Watson repeated quietly as they climbed the service stairs. "A Russian name, surely?" "Indeed. And combined with the fragment of Russian correspondence we found at Belgrave Square, it suggests that Sir Edmund Blackwood's past has returned to claim him in ways his son never anticipated." Holmes paused on the landing, his expression grave. "We are no longer dealing with a simple domestic mystery, Watson. We have stumbled into something far larger, something with roots that stretch across borders, and perhaps across decades." They found Mary Corbett on the 3rd floor, emerging from a guest room with an armload of soiled linens. She was a young woman of perhaps 25 years, with copper-colored hair pinned beneath a white cap and the sturdy build of someone accustomed to physical labor. Her face bore the ruddy complexion common to those of Irish descent, and her eyes, a striking shade of green, widened with alarm as Holmes approached her. "Miss Corbett? A moment of your time, if you please." She clutched the linens to her chest like a shield, her gaze darting toward the service stairs as if calculating the possibility of escape. "I have work to do, sir. The housekeeper will be cross if I fall behind schedule. This will take only a few minutes, I assure you." Holmes produced a sovereign from his pocket and held it between his fingers where the light caught its golden gleam. "I am investigating the death of the gentleman in room 412. I understand you were the one who discovered him." Mary Corbett's face paled beneath its flush, and her grip on the linens tightened until her knuckles turned white. "I already told the police everything I know. And the other gentleman, the foreign one, he told me I was not to speak of it again. He said there would be consequences if I did." "The foreign gentleman with the silver-handled walking stick?" Holmes inquired. "The one who spoke with your manager?" Her silence was answer enough. Watson felt a surge of protective indignation at the fear evident in the young woman's manner. She had clearly been threatened, and not subtly. "Miss Corbett," he said gently, stepping forward to place himself between her and any watching eyes, "we are not here to cause you trouble. We represent the family of the deceased, and we seek only the truth. Whatever that foreign gentleman told you, I give you my word as a physician and a gentleman that no harm will come to you for speaking with us." Something in Watson's earnest manner seemed to reach her. The rigid tension in her shoulders eased slightly, and she glanced around before gesturing toward an open supply closet at the end of the corridor. "In there. We can speak privately, but only for a moment." They followed her into the cramped space, surrounded by shelves of cleaning supplies and fresh linens. Mary set down her bundle and faced them with an expression of reluctant determination. "The old gentleman checked in on the afternoon of October 4th, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember because he asked specifically for a room on the upper floor, away from the noise of the street. He seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow him." "Did he give a name?" Holmes asked. "Blackwood. Sir Edmund Blackwood. He wrote it in the register himself, though his hand shook something terrible." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "He took his meals in his room and refused housekeeping services. Said he did not wish to be disturbed under any circumstances. But I saw him once, through the doorway when I passed with fresh towels for another guest. He was sitting at the writing desk, surrounded by papers, writing as fast as his pen could move." "And on the evening of October 5th? Mary's face grew troubled, shadows of memory darkening her eyes. "I was working late that night. We were short-staffed, and the housekeeper asked me to stay on. Around 11 o'clock, I heard a commotion from the 4th floor. Voices raised in argument, though I could not make out the words. Then silence, complete silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle." She crossed herself quickly, a gesture of instinctive superstition. "I went up to investigate, thinking perhaps a guest had taken ill. The door to Fort Welve was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. 'Take your time,' Watson said softly. 'He was lying on the bed, sir. The old gentleman. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his face was twisted in the most terrible expression of fear I have ever seen, like he had glimpsed the devil himself in his final moments.'" Holmes leaned forward intently. "Was there anyone else in the room? Any sign of struggle or violence?" "No one. But the window was open, and when I looked out, I saw a figure climbing down the fire escape, a man in a dark coat, moving quick as a cat. He reached the alley below and vanished into the shadows before I could call for help. Could you describe this man?" Mary shook her head slowly. "It was too dark, and he moved too fast. But there was one thing. When he reached the bottom, he paused beneath the gas lamp for just an instant. I saw his face in the light, and he was smiling, sir. A cold, terrible smile, like a man who had just completed some dreadful task and found satisfaction in its completion." Holmes absorbed this information in silence, his expression unreadable. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cramped closet. "One final question, Miss Corbett. The papers you mentioned, the ones Sir Edmund was writing when you glimpsed him through the doorway, were they still present when you discovered his body?" Mary's brow furrowed in concentration. "Now that you mention it, sir, no. The desk was completely bare. Whatever he had been writing, it was gone." Holmes pressed the sovereign into Mary Corbett's trembling hand and thanked her for her courage in speaking with them. They departed the supply closet separately to avoid drawing attention, with Holmes and Watson descending through the service corridors rather than the main staircase. The detective remained silent until they had emerged onto a narrow side street behind the hotel. Away from the bustle of the Strand. "The picture begins to take shape. Watson," Holmes said at last, his breath forming small clouds in the cold October air. "Sir Edmund Blackwood, a man with dangerous secrets and powerful enemies, stages his own death on October 3rd to escape some imminent threat. He dismisses his servants, abandons his Belgrave Square residence, and checks into the Grand Imperial under his own name, apparently believing himself safe. But why use his real name?" Watson interjected. "Surely that was foolish if he wished to remain hidden." "An excellent observation, and one that has troubled me as well. Unless," Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing in thought, "unless Sir Edmund was not hiding at all. Unless his presence at the Grand Imperial was itself a message, a signal to someone who would know to look for him there. A confederate? An ally, possibly. Or possibly someone he intended to meet, Someone with whom he meant to exchange those papers, Mary Corbett, saw him writing. Holmes began walking briskly toward the main thoroughfare, his long strides forcing Watson to hurry to keep pace. Consider the sequence of events. Sir Edmund stages his death on October 3rd, using Dr. Mercer to send a telegram confirming his demise. He then moves to the hotel on October 4th, where he spends the day writing furiously. On the evening of October 5th, someone visits him, there's an argument, and Sir Edmund dies for the second time. But this death, I suspect, was not staged. Watson felt the weight of the implications settling upon him. You believe he was murdered. The second death was genuine. I believe it is the most logical interpretation of the evidence. The expression of terror upon his face, the figure fleeing down the fire escape, the disappearance of the papers, all point to a violent end rather than a peaceful passing. Holmes hailed a passing cab and gave the driver an address in Harley Street. But we are still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Why did Sir Edmund stage his first death? What were the papers he was writing? And who is this Volkov whose name so frightened the hotel manager? The cab carried them through the crowded streets toward the medical district, where the city's most distinguished physicians maintained their practices. Watson recognized the address Holmes had given. They were heading to the offices of Dr. Howard Mercer, the vanished physician who had signed Sir Edmund's first death certificate. Do you expect to find him there? Watson asked. The hotel clerk said his landlady reported him gone. I expect to find nothing, Holmes replied. But the absence of evidence is itself a form of evidence. What a man leaves behind when he flees tells us much about the nature of his flight. They arrived at a handsome townhouse on a quiet stretch of Harley Street, its brass nameplate still bearing Dr. Mercer's name and credentials. Holmes rang the bell, and after a considerable delay, the door was opened by an elderly woman in a housekeeper's apron. Her face bore the pinched expression of someone who had recently endured considerable upheaval. We are not receiving patients, she announced before Holmes could speak. Dr. Mercer has closed his practice indefinitely. I am not a patient, madam. I am Sherlock Holmes, and I am investigating a matter in which Dr. Mercer may have been involved. Holmes produced his card and presented it with a slight bow. Might I trouble you for a few moments of conversation? I assure you, my interest is in assisting the doctor, not in causing him further difficulty. The housekeeper's stern facade wavered slightly at the mention of Holmes' name. I have read of you in the papers, sir. The affair of the speckled band, and that terrible business with the Baskerville hound. She stepped aside reluctantly. Very well, but I can tell you little. The doctor left 3 days ago without explanation, and I have heard nothing from him since. They entered a well-appointed hallway that led to a consultation room at the rear of the house. The room itself was in considerable disarray, drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the desk, medical instruments left carelessly upon surfaces where precision and order should have reigned. He packed in great haste, Holmes observed, running his fingers along the edge of the desk. These drawers have been emptied rapidly, without care for the contents. And here, he lifted a small leather case that had fallen behind the desk, its contents spilling across the carpet. His personal medical kit, left behind in his hurry. A physician does not abandon such an item unless he fears something worse than the inconvenience of practicing without it. Watson knelt to examine the scattered instruments. Among them lay a small glass vial, identical in shape to the one they had found at Belgrave Square. Morphine, he confirmed. The same preparation, the same dosage. Dr. Mercer was certainly the source of the drug we found in Sir Edmund's bedroom. Holmes nodded grimly. The question now is whether he administered it as a physician or as something far more sinister. Holmes spent the next quarter hour conducting a methodical search of Dr. Mercer's consultation room while the housekeeper watched with growing unease. Watson assisted where he could, his medical training allowing him to recognize which items were standard to a physician's practice and which seemed out of place. It was among the latter that Holmes made his most significant discovery. Tucked behind a row of medical texts on the uppermost shelf sat a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Holmes retrieved it with evident interest. Noting the faded inscription carved into its lid, a series of Cyrillic characters that neither he nor Watson could immediately decipher. "Russian again," Watson murmured. "The connection grows stronger." Holmes opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled upon a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of items that seemed incongruous with their medical surroundings. A tarnished military medal bearing the double-headed eagle of Imperial Russia. A faded photograph of 3 young men in military uniforms. And a folded letter whose paper had yellowed with age. "Mrs. Patterson," Holmes addressed the housekeeper, who had been watching their search with mounting anxiety. "How long has Dr. Mercer maintained this practice?" 15 years, sir. He came to London from abroad from the continent, though he never spoke of where precisely. He was a good employer, quiet and private in his ways. I never had cause to complain." "And did he receive many visitors?" "Particularly in recent weeks." The housekeeper's expression shifted, a shadow of fear crossing her features. "There was one gentleman, foreign like the doctor himself, though his accent was Differentshire somehow. He came 3 times in the fortnight before the doctor left. Each time, they would close themselves in the consultation room for hours, speaking in a language I did not recognize." Holmes unfolded the letter from the box and studied it intently. Though written in Russian, certain words were underlined with evident emphasis. And at the bottom of the page, 3 signatures appeared, each in a different hand. "Watson, your knowledge of continental history. What can you tell me of Russian military operations in the Balkans during the 1870s? Watson considered the question carefully. There was the Russo-Turkish War, of course. Considerable bloodshed, political intrigue, the usual consequences of imperial ambition. Why do you ask? Because unless I am mistaken, this medal," Holmes lifted the tarnished decoration from its velvet bed, "was awarded for service during that very conflict. And this photograph shows 3 young officers, likely attached to the intelligence services of the Tsar's army. Look closely at the face on the left." Watson examined the faded image, squinting to make out the features. The young man in question was tall and lean, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through the decades. "I cannot say I recognize him." "You would not, in this youthful form. But imagine him aged by 30 years, his hair turned gray, his bearing marked by decades of clandestine service." Holmes retrieved the photograph. He had borrowed from Arthur Blackwood's hotel room earlier that morning a recent portrait of Sir Edmund that the Sun had provided. Now compare the two. The resemblance, once pointed out, was unmistakable. The shape of the jaw, the distinctive set of the eyes, the particular angle of the brow. Sir Edmund Blackwood had once worn the uniform of a Russian military officer. Watson stared at the images in disbelief. But Sir Edmund served the British Crown. He was a diplomat, an advisor to prime ministers. Surely he could not have been a Russian agent? A defector who switched allegiances? Or perhaps something more complex, a man who served multiple masters, playing both sides of the great game for purposes we have yet to understand? Holmes returned the items to the box and tucked it beneath his coat. The truth, I suspect, lies buried in the past, a past that someone has gone to considerable lengths to conceal. They departed Dr. Mercer's residence with more questions than answers, the fog having returned to cloak the streets in its gray embrace. Holmes walked in silence for several blocks, his mind clearly engaged in the complex work of synthesis and deduction that characterized his approach to investigation. "We must speak with Arthur Blackwood again," he said at last. "There are questions about his father's history that require answers that may prove difficult for a son to hear." "You intend to tell him of this discovery? That his father may have been a Russian agent?" I intend to determine the truth, whatever form it may take." Holmes' expression was grim. "But first, there is another thread I wish to pursue. The name Volkov has appeared twice now, once from the hotel clerk, and again in the frightened whispers of those who have encountered the foreign gentleman with the silver-handled walking stick. If we are to understand who killed Sir Edmund Blackwood, we must first understand who this Volkov is and what connection he bears to the past that haunts this case." Watson nodded, though a sense of foreboding had settled into his bones. They were approaching something dark and dangerous, a web of secrets that stretched across decades and continents. Whatever truth awaited them, he suspected it would prove more terrible than either of them could yet imagine. The evening had descended upon London with its customary swiftness, transforming the gray afternoon into a darkness punctuated only by the flickering glow of gas lamps. Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street to find an urgent telegram awaiting them upon the mantelpiece. Its envelope bearing the distinctive seal of Arthur Blackwood's Marylebone. Holmes tore it open and scanned the contents, his expression shifting from curiosity to sharp alertness. "Our client requests an immediate meeting. He claims to have discovered something of vital importance among his father's personal effects, something he dared not commit to writing. Shall we go to him? He is already on his way here. The telegram was sent an hour ago." Holmes moved to the window and peered down at the fog-shrouded street below. "In fact, unless I am mistaken, that is his cab approaching now." Within minutes, Arthur Blackwood had ascended the stairs to their sitting room, his appearance even more disheveled than before. His eyes were wild with a mixture of fear and excitement, and clutched in his hands was a leather journal, its covers worn and stained with age. "I found it hidden in the false bottom of my father's traveling trunk," he explained breathlessly, thrusting the journal toward Holmes. "I nearly missed it entirely. The compartment was concealed with extraordinary skill. But something about the weight of the trunk seemed wrong. And when I investigated further, Holmes accepted the journal and opened it carefully, his eyes traveling across pages filled with dense, coded writing. Your father kept a private record of his activities. How much of this have you read?" "Enough to understand that my father was not the man I believed him to be." Arthur's voice cracked with emotion. "He was a spy, Mr. Holmes. For decades, he operated as a double agent, feeding information to both the British and Russian governments while serving his own mysterious purposes. The journal contains names, dates, operations, a complete record of his clandestine career." Watson watched Holmes' face as the detective absorbed this information. There was no surprise in his expression, only the grim satisfaction of a theory confirmed. "Does the journal mention a man named Volkov?" Arthur nodded slowly. "Extensively. According to my father's writings, Dmitry Volkov was his handler during the early years, his contact within Russian intelligence. They worked together for nearly a decade before something happened, some betrayal that turned them into mortal enemies. My father writes of Volkov with a hatred that borders on obsession." Holmes turned to a page near the end of the journal, where the entries grew more recent and more frantic. "Listen to this, Watson. Dated September 28th of this year, less than a week before the first obituary appeared. Volkov has found me at last. After 30 years, the wolf has tracked his prey to ground. I must act quickly if I am to survive, and if the truth is to be preserved. The documents must reach safe hands before he can silence me forever." "The documents," Watson repeated. "The papers Mary Corbett saw him writing at the Grand Imperial." "Precisely. Sir Edmund knew Volkov was coming for him. He staged his first death to buy time to complete whatever record he was compiling and deliver it to someone he trusted." Holmes continued reading, his brow furrowing with concentration. "But something went wrong. The journal ends abruptly on October 4th with a single cryptic entry. The arrangement is made. Tomorrow night, the exchange will occur. God forgive me for what I have done and what I must yet do. Arthur Blackwood sank into a chair, his face pale. My father arranged to meet someone on the night he died. Someone he intended to give the documents to. And Volkov discovered the plan, Holmes concluded. He arrived before the exchange could take place, killed your father, and took the documents for himself. He closed the journal and held it up thoughtfully. But this he did not find. This record of your father's life and crimes, this Sir Edmund concealed too well for even Volkov to discover. A heavy silence fell upon the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Watson could see the wheels turning in Holmes' mind, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with mechanical precision. There is one more thing, Arthur said quietly. At the very back of the journal, my father wrote a single address. He underlined it 3 times and wrote beside it, "If I should fail, seek the truth here." Holmes opened the journal to its final page. There, in Sir Edmund's trembling hand, was written an address in the East End, a warehouse near the Limehouse docks. "Then that is where we must go," Holmes declared, rising to his feet with sudden energy. "Tonight, before Volkov realizes how close we are to unraveling his secrets." Watson reached for his coat and his revolver, a familiar weight that brought cold comfort in moments of danger. "You believe we will find answers there?" "I believe we will find Volkov himself," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with fierce anticipation. "And with him, the truth of how and why the old man died twice." The fog hung thick over Limehouse as their cab rattled through increasingly narrow streets. The grand facades of central London giving way to the grimy warehouses and cramped tenements of the Docklands. The air carried the mingled scents of the Thames salt and tar, and the faint decay of things left too long in darkness. Watson gripped his revolver beneath his coat. Its familiar weight, a cold comfort against the growing sense of danger that pressed upon him. Holmes had insisted that Arthur Blackwood remain behind at Baker Street. Despite the young man's passionate protests, "Your presence would only complicate matters," the detective had explained with characteristic bluntness. "Volkov knows your face, and he will not hesitate to use you as leverage against us. Stay here, keep the journal safe, and trust that we shall return with the answers you seek." Now, as the cab drew to a halt at the edge of a desolate wharf, Watson found himself grateful for Holmes' foresight. The warehouse that matched Sir Edmund's address loomed before them, a massive structure of blackened brick, its windows dark and empty like the eye sockets of a skull. No light burned within, and no sound emerged from its depths. "It appears abandoned," Watson observed quietly. "Appearances, my dear Watson, are the currency of deception." Holmes paid the driver and instructed him to wait at a distance, then approached the warehouse with the cautious tread of a man expecting danger at every turn. Volkov has survived 30 years as a Russian intelligence operative. He did not achieve such longevity by announcing his presence with illumination and noise. They found a side entrance, a rusted iron door that yielded to Holmes' lockpicks after a few moments of careful manipulation. The interior was vast and shadowed, filled with the hulking shapes of abandoned machinery and stacked crates that formed a labyrinth of narrow passages. The air was stale and cold, carrying a faint chemical odor that Watson recognized, but could not immediately place. Holmes produced a small electric torch. From his pocket, one of the modern conveniences he had recently adopted, and swept its beam across the dusty floor. Footprints were visible in the accumulated grime, leading deeper into the warehouse. "Recent," Holmes murmured. "Within the last few hours. We are not the first visitors tonight." They followed the trail through the maze of crates, moving in silence, their senses straining for any indication of danger. The footprints led to a cleared space near the center of the warehouse, where a table had been set up beneath a hanging lamp. Upon the table lay a scattered collection of papers, and slumped in a chair beside it, his head thrown back at an unnatural angle, sat a man Watson had never seen before. Holmes approached the body with clinical detachment. examining the face, the hands, the posture of death. Dr. Howard Mercer, I presume. His flight from London ended here, in the company of those he sought to escape. Watson moved closer, his medical instincts overriding his revulsion. The cause of death was immediately apparent, a thin red line across the throat, the wound of a blade wielded with surgical precision. He has been dead less than an hour. The blood is barely congealed, which means his killer may still be nearby. Holmes straightened, his eyes scanning the shadows with renewed alertness. Mercer was a loose end, Watson. He knew too much about Sir Edmund's staged death, and Volkov could not risk allowing him to talk. Then Volkov has what he wanted. The documents, the witnesses all eliminated, not all. The voice came from the darkness beyond the circle of lamplight, a voice heavy with a Slavic accent. Cold and measured and utterly without mercy. There remains the matter of you, Mr. Holmes, and your faithful companion. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Watson found himself facing the man whose specter had haunted their investigation from its beginning. Dmitri Volkov was tall and gaunt, his face carved with the deep lines of age and cruelty. His gray hair was cropped short in military fashion, and his eyes pale blue and utterly devoid of warmth fixed upon Holmes with the calculating regard of a predator assessing its prey. In his right hand, he carried the silver-handled walking stick that had been described to them. In his left, he held a revolver aimed directly at Holmes' heart. I had hoped you would come, Volkov continued, stepping fully into the light. When I learned that Arthur Blackwood had engaged the famous Sherlock Holmes, I knew it was only a matter of time before you followed the trail to this place. You are predictable, Mr. Holmes, a man of logic and method. Such men are easy to anticipate. Holmes regarded the Russian with an expression of mild interest, as if they were discussing the weather rather than facing imminent death. And yet you waited for us rather than fleeing. That suggests you want something you believe we can provide. Volkov's thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. Perceptive as always. Yes, Mr. Holmes, there's something I require. The journal Sir Edmund's private record of his treachery. I know his son discovered it, and I know you have seen its contents. Where is it? Safe, Holmes replied. Beyond your reach. Nothing is beyond my reach. Volkov's voice hardened. I have spent 30 years hunting Edmund Blackwood. 30 years pursuing the man who betrayed me, who stole secrets that were meant for Moscow and sold them to the highest bidder. He was not a double agent, Mr. Holmes, he was a traitor to everyone. Loyal only to himself and his precious fortune. Watson's mind raced, searching for some opportunity, some means of turning the situation to their advantage. His revolver remained beneath his coat, but any movement toward it would surely result in Holmes' death. He forced himself to remain still, to listen, to wait for the moment that must surely come. You killed him, Holmes said. At the Grand Imperial Hotel, on the night of October 5th. You discovered his plan to exchange documents with a contact, and you arrived before the exchange could occur. He thought himself so clever, staging his own death to throw me off the scent. But I knew Edmund Blackwood better than he knew himself. I knew he would not simply disappear. His vanity would not permit it. He needed to leave a record, a testament to his genius. So I watched and I waited, and when he emerged from hiding, I was there. The papers he was writing, Watson interjected. What were they? Volkov's gaze shifted to him briefly, dismissively. A confession. Names, dates, operations, everything he had done over 40 years of treachery. He intended to give it to British intelligence, to buy himself protection in his final years. But the information in those papers would have exposed not only Edmund, but dozens of other operatives still active throughout Europe. I could not permit that. So you took the papers and killed him, Holmes concluded. But you did not find the journal. The one record that could expose you as thoroughly as it exposed Sir Edmund. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Volkov's face. The journal contains my name. It documents our association during the early years before Edmund's betrayal. If it were to fall into the wrong hands, your masters in Moscow would learn that you failed to contain a threat you should have eliminated decades ago. Holmes finished. Your career, your reputation, perhaps your life, all would be forfeit. The Russian's expression hardened into something dangerous. Which is why you will tell me where it is, now. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes locked with Volkov's pale blue. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of a man holding cards his opponent could not see. I think not. You see, Mr. Volkov, while we have been having this illuminating conversation, you have failed to notice that we did not come alone. Volkov's eyes widened, and in that instant of distraction, the warehouse exploded into chaos. From the shadows behind the Russian emerged Inspector Lestrade and half a dozen armed constables, their weapons trained upon the assassin from multiple angles. Watson seized the moment, drawing his revolver and leveling it at Volkov's chest. "Drop your weapon," Lestrade commanded. "You are surrounded." For a heartbeat, Volkov seemed to consider resistance. His finger tightened upon the trigger, his aim still fixed upon Holmes. Then, slowly, the tension drained from his frame, and he allowed the revolver to fall to the floor with a clatter that echoed through the vast space. "You planned this," he said to Holmes, something like admiration mingling with the hatred in his voice. "The cab, the delay at Baker Street, you were giving the police time to position themselves." "I sent word to Lestrade before we departed," Holmes confirmed. "A simple precaution. I suspected you would be waiting for us, and I have learned through long experience that even the most brilliant deductions are worthless if one is not alive to share them." As the constables moved forward to secure the prisoner, Watson found himself releasing a breath he'd not realized he was holding. The case was concluded, the murderer apprehended, and the truth, however dark, had finally been brought to light. Later, in the warmth of their Baker Street sitting room, Holmes would explain the full chain of reasoning that had led them to their quarry. He would reveal how the fragment of Russian correspondence, the military medal, and the photograph had combined to suggest Sir Edmund's true history. He would describe how the journal had confirmed his suspicions and how the address in Limehouse had provided the final piece of the puzzle. Arthur Blackwood would learn the painful truth about his father, that Sir Edmund had been neither hero nor villain, but something more complex and more human, a man who had made terrible choices in pursuit of survival, and who had ultimately been destroyed by the consequences of those choices. And Dmitri Volkov would face justice, not in a British court, but through quiet diplomatic channels that would see him return to Russia in chains, where the masters he had failed would exact their own terrible price for his incompetence. But all of that lay in the future. For now, as the constables led Volkov away into the fog-shrouded night, Holmes turned to Watson with the faintest suggestion of a smile upon his thin lips. "The old man who died twice," he mused. "In the end, Watson, it was not the deaths that mattered, but the life that preceded them. The sins of the past have a way of finding us, no matter how cleverly we try to hide." Watson nodded slowly, holstering his revolver. "And the truth?" "The truth is rarely pure and never simple," Holmes replied, echoing a sentiment Watson had heard before. "But it is always, in the end, worth pursuing." They stepped out into the cold October night, leaving behind the warehouse and its secrets, and made their way back toward the familiar comfort of Baker Street, where new mysteries awaited. And the game, as always, was afoot.